Hello everybody, it's Wyvern here with another History vs. Warhammer video. Now it's been a while since I last touched upon this series, and so I wanted to return to it with a topic that you guys have been clamoring for a while, and one that I've been looking forward to doing for a while, and that's repeating weaponry. Whether multi-shot or repeating crossbows, firearms, and their various variants, it's a request I've seen quite a bit, but also a massive topic, and so I wanted to break it down into chunks. And in this first chunk, this first video, we are going to cover repeating weapons before the advent of black powder. And what that really means is that we're going to cover repeating crossbows. There are very few, and when I say very few, I mean very few repeating weapon designs before the advent of black powder. Simple fact is the vast majority of projectile weapons prior to the advent of black powder just do not lend themselves to any mechanical rate of fire improvements, besides really crossbows and their bigger variants, ballistas, scorpions, bolt throwers, however you may know them. Now that is not to say you can't, for example, attach a magazine to a bow. This has been done by modern day enthusiasts. I believe Jorg on YouTube has created and has videos of a magazine fed bow he designed based on historical guide rails that were used for training bows. However, magazines were not used on bows historically. As far as we're aware, there are no such examples, and they certainly were not used in a sort of service fashion, assuming they were even designed. And like I said, we just do not have information on them ever being designed in the first place. But it is certainly an interesting proof of concept, and I would certainly check out his videos if you're curious to see what a magazine-fed bow could look like. But that really just leaves a handful of options. Of course, the most infamous version of the repeating crossbow, or really the only real version of the repeating crossbow, the Chinese Zhuge Nu or Zhuge Nu, and its different historical variants, as well as its Korean variations. The Koreans took this weapon and evolved it, adapted it a bit, improved it in some ways, as well as the scaled up versions of these weapons that were used in an artillery fashion or otherwise multi-shot crossbows that the Chinese supposedly used in an artillery role. And the other major example that we're going to be covering is the Greek Polybolos. This was a repeating ballista designed during ancient times. There's not too much information on it, and unfortunately there's not too much information on the larger Chinese crossbows or artillery crossbows either, but we will certainly be trying to touch upon them and examine how they may have been used, or just how exactly they function. After that, of course, as usual, we will be looking at their Warhammer equivalents, the Warhammer repeating weapons, or repeating crossbows, and seeing how exactly they compare to their historical counterparts. Whether they're completely ridiculous and over the top, or whether they're perhaps a little bit viable, or perhaps a little bit logical. We'll certainly be examining that in some detail. Now, as usual, guys, if you have your own requests for future videos you'd like to see, certainly post them down below. I do keep tabs on what's been requested. And if a topic comes up enough, I'll certainly try to prioritize it over others. Otherwise, I do simply have a list of topics I'm trying to cover. If you have your own input, your own additional information you'd like to share, if you think I've missed something, or think there's just some information you'd like to share, don't hesitate to put it down below. I think it's always great to share information and share knowledge and learn. I think it's great. So certainly don't hesitate if you have additional sources or anything you'd like to share. And without further ado, let's dive into the history of repeating weapons, part 1. So the first weapon on this list, and really the most significant weapon on this list, is the Chinese Zhuge Nu, the Zhuge Nu, as sometimes romanized, the repeating crossbow. And this weapon was one that is often associated, in fact derives its name from its association with the Chinese inventor, scholar, military commander, and most significantly politician, Zhuge Liang. He was a Chinese, he was actually the regent and chancellor of the Chinese state of Shuhan during the Three Kingdoms period, during the early 3rd century in particular, and he is often attributed the invention of this weapon. However, this attribution is in fact erroneous. We know this due to the fact that the earliest examples of the repeating crossbow actually predate him by several centuries. However, the name and the association has sort of stuck over the years. The earliest examples we have are actually date all the way back to the 4th century BC. This does lend some credence to other theories about the origins of the weapon, often associated with a man named Qin from the state of Chu. And this kind of lines up with some of the earliest examples we have. The earliest repeating crossbow currently discovered was one found in the Qinjiazui tomb complex in 247, and this is in the former Chinese state of Chu. And this weapon actually predates the earliest written records of repeating crossbows. And due to that fact, we don't even have a specific official name or historical name for the weapon. As such, it's often referred to as simply the Zhanguo Lianfa Nu, the Warring States period rapid-fire crossbow, or the Chuguo Lianfa Nu, the rapid-fire crossbow from the state of Chu. And before I do continue, I want to apologize ahead of time for any butchered pronunciations. I don't speak Chinese. I will certainly do my best to pronounce things correctly. However, if it's not the case, certainly feel free to call me out in the comments below and correct me. But I just wanted to put that little disclaimer in there. Now, this early repeating crossbow, the Lianfa Nu, as it's called, was actually more advanced in some ways than later repeating crossbows. For one, the box magazine was actually fixed to the weapon. This box magazine had enough space for 10 bolts. Or I should say 10 shots and 20 bolts. It actually fired 2 bolts at once, which is a nice little feature to get extra rate of fire out of the weapon. And this stationary or fixed box magazine would have improved stability in comparison to later repeating crossbow designs, where the magazine actually moved with the spanning device. Now, besides that, it also does have a pistol grip. This is actually a significant feature for stability. Once again, it actually allows you to aim the weapon. Later repeating crossbows, you kind of hold them at the hip and you work the spanning device back and forth and unleash a stream of arrows. Now, this is nice to achieve a high rate of fire and good saturation of a target, but it means your accuracy is terrible. And the early repeating crossbows of later periods were really pretty terrible accuracy-wise. In comparison, this Lianfa Nu actually allows you some accuracy. The spanning device is also mounted at the back of the bow, rather than at the top. And this, once again, allows you to shoot the bow sort of like a slingshot, rather than a later repeating crossbow. Makes it easier to aim. It also has an actual trigger mechanism, so it functions more akin to a conventional crossbow with just low draw weight and a magazine on top, rather than some of the later repeating crossbow designs. And these are some significant differences there. However, it also had its downsides. For one, the trigger mechanism is kind of a problem for a weapon that ultimately was used largely by peasant armies or sort of massive armies of relatively ill-trained troops, or otherwise used for civilian home defense or hunting. And you don't want a complicated metal trigger mechanism for a weapon used for such a purpose. It was also supposedly prone to jamming, and pretty significantly, it was supposedly weak even by repeating crossbow standards, which is pretty darn weak. From what I've been able to glean, the average repeating crossbow draw weight would have been somewhere between 40 to 70 pounds. That would have really been the strongest of the bunch, and that was the draw weight on the bows used for these weapons, and that's really not very impressive. That's pretty darn weak for a warbow. And supposedly the Lianfa Nu actually had worse draw, or was weaker than that, and one would assume that the draw weight was thus significantly worse. That's kind of bad. It would probably have meant that its actual military usage or usefulness in a military situation would have been pretty darn limited if it was not able to generate enough stopping power. That said, it is a great point of reference, I think. Unfortunately, we don't know too much about the Lianfa Nu's actual combat service. We don't really know how it was utilized, or really when the transition was made from this design to the later and much more proliferous Zhuge Nu style of repeating crossbow, the cheaper and more mass-produced version, and we don't really know when that jump sort of occurred. But this early example is nice as a point of reference in comparison to later designs. In some ways, it's actually closer to the version we have in Warhammer. The Warhammer version is closer to this historical version than the more mass-produced one. And I think it is good to sort of eradicate some of the myths about how this weapon originated, as well as helping establish that sort of starting point for when Chinese repeating crossbow development occurred. Now, certainly the weapon probably would have predated this first discovered example. This is simply the earliest archaeological evidence, not necessarily the earliest example. But I still do believe it is a good sort of reference point, and certainly nice to see how Chinese repeating crossbow evolution occurred. And there was actually this sort of simplification that we are going to see as we progress into the later designs. Now, the next weapon we're going to discuss is the Ming Dynasty Zhuge Nu. And this is really the quintessential Chinese repeating crossbow. Chances are, if you imagine a repeating crossbow, this is the weapon that comes to mind, the Zhuge Nu, and likely not the preceding variant or even the Korean variant. Now, the weapon was certainly not limited to the Ming Dynasty, as you can probably tell by the name of Zhuge Nu and the fact that it was associated with a Three Kingdoms era leader. The weapon was certainly not limited to the Ming Dynasty time period, which was from the 14th into the 17th centuries. It's really a weapon that had been around long before then, and would continue to see service long after the fall of the Ming Dynasty, operating with the Qing right up until the 19th century. However, this general design is referred to as the Ming Dynasty design, and is how we will be referring to it in this video. The design was pretty different from the preceding Lian Fa Nu. The method of operation was, for one, much simpler. The magazine was simply attached to the spanning device, the spanning lever atop the weapon. As the lever was pushed forward, the groove in the magazine would be pushed forward to take hold of the bowstring. Then as the spanning device was pulled back, the bowstring would be pulled back with it, thereby drawing the crossbow to full draw. And as the magazine was pulled down, the bowstring would be pulled down atop a trigger mechanism. Now, this was not necessarily a mechanism; it was likely just a trigger plate or sort of a wooden point that would push the string up, thereby releasing the string and firing the arrow. And this process would simply be repeated over and over until the magazine had run dry. And this allowed a pretty impressive rate of fire. It could be up to 20. If you were firing with 2 shots at once or 2 projectiles at once, it could achieve something like 20 rounds in 15 seconds, which is pretty extraordinary for a weapon in the ancient, or I should say late ancient and early medieval time period. And even for a weapon around later than that, even by 19th century standards, that's a pretty hefty rate of fire. Now, while the weapon did have potential to be manufactured to high quality, this was rarely, if ever, done. The majority of these weapons were manufactured to very cheap and low standards. The Zhuge Nu was usually manufactured with readily available materials, such as Chinese mulberry wood or bamboo strips lashed together, rather than using a recurved bow for the prod or any more powerful prod. What often tended to be the case was that a simple straight prod manufactured out of those same earlier mentioned cheap materials would be used instead. And while this meant the weapon could be made by just about anybody, just about anywhere, it also meant the weapon's staying power was pretty darn limited. And it was not considered a very effective battlefield weapon. It's not to say it was not used on the battlefield, and it did have some usage, as we will see in just a little bit. And the ways in which it was used tended to be pretty specific. But the design was certainly limited. Now, prior to the Qing repeating crossbow, and specifically during the Ming era, one of the key differences in how the repeating crossbow was operated was that the arrows it fired were fletched. During the Qing period, the projectiles, the bolts, were actually unfletched. And while I'm not entirely sure if this was the case prior to the Ming, I actually believe that prior to the Ming they were also often fletched. It seems to have been that during the Ming Dynasty the crossbow bolts were more consistently fletched. It seems to have been the case. And this resulted in some stability issues, some reliability issues, and some jamming issues, and it certainly was not ideal. And the Qing kind of realized that and did away with arrow fletching. Now, as for the weapon's actual function, well, we can see how it was viewed through the eyes of several scholars or writers during the period in which it saw service. And generally the reports are what I would call less than glowing. For example, from the late Ming encyclopedia, the Tiangong Kaiwu, we see a note that while the Zhuge crossbow is a magazine that can contain up to 10 bolts, it's weak. Its range is a mere 20 paces, and it's described as a weapon that is meant for civilian use against bandits, aka unarmored or lightly armored if at all armored opposition, and not a weapon for the armed forces. At the same time, the Wu Beiji, which was a military treatise at the period, notes that the weapon is is weak and cannot wound people. That the crossbow can be used by weak individuals and by women to protect the city. That it can fire 10 bolts continuously, which is great on paper, but the projectile needs to be coated with tiger-killing poison to make it effective, and the likely poison that is described there is aconite. That's what's believed by historians to be the tiger-killing poison that these treatises describe. And later on with the Qing, we see a similar concern pop up as to the repeating crossbow's power. The Gujin Tushu Jisheng, which was the imperial encyclopedia from the early 18th century, encyclopedia written between 1700 and 1725, describes the Zhuge Nu as a weapon that can, even a Confucian scholar, aka in the terms of this book, it's implied a wimp or somebody who's weaker, or palace women, can use the weapon in self-defense. But it fires so weakly that you have to tip it with poison. Once again, tiger-killing poison is recommended as the coating of choice. It's likely that in actual warfare, either aconite was utilized, or in some cases, likely feces or dung was used in its stead, because that is a cheap and readily available pseudo-poison. However, what is clear from all these treatises, as well as seemingly by the weapons utilized throughout the period, is that the repeating crossbow was not considered a great military weapon. It certainly had niche applications. It could be very powerful as a last-ditch weapon. It could be potent in a siege situation where a relatively small quantity of soldiers could unleash a massive quantity of firepower very, very quickly. But its lack of range was, of course, a significant weakness, as was the lack of stopping power. One example we can see of its usage comes from the year 180 AD, so actually preceding even the Three Kingdoms era. And this was supposedly under the leadership of Yang Zhuan, who was a protector in Zingling. And he attempted to suppress rebel activity there with forces that were heavily outnumbered. And so to compensate for that, he utilized wagons loaded with sacks of lime so as to blind his opponents, as well as with automatic crossbows mounted on the wagons. And supposedly the way it worked is that the repeating crossbows were actually linked to the wheels, and as the wheels of the wagon moved, the crossbows continuously fired until the magazines would be spent. And this supposedly worked very well and inflicted heavy casualties on the rebels. Whether or not this is a truthful description, or if this is simply a romanticization of true events, whatever the case may be, it does show that the weapon could have some usefulness against what was likely lightly armored and ill-equipped troops. And certainly in Chinese warfare, oftentimes the armies were not much of the armies would not be particularly well equipped in armor, much as we see, honestly, much as was the case in European warfare for much of the ancient period and medieval period. Many armies could simply not afford the best arms and armor, and as a result, a repeating crossbow could inflict some harm, certainly, as long as it was not outranged by heavier true crossbows or bows, which could be far more lethal. The Ming crossbow's effective range was considered, repeating crossbow's effective range was considered about 70 meters, which is certainly not enough to match a war bow or a heavy crossbow. So that was certainly a downside there. But against lightly armored opposition, the weapon could produce some results. When deployed in mass, the sheer quantity of firepower could compensate for the lack of individual staying power, much in the same way as, for example, the English longbows which, while significantly more powerful weapon than the repeating crossbow, really relied on quantity to overcome French armor in many cases, especially during the latter portions of the 100 Years' War. The penetration was simply no longer adequate, and quantity became a substitute for power. And this seems to have been very much the case in the few instances where the repeating crossbow was used. Now, the repeating crossbows continued to see use throughout the Ming period. The Qing dynasty picked up the weapon and continued using it. And in fact, under Qing rule, it was actually simply known as the new gong, the crossbow. And this was due to the fact that the regular crossbow was supposedly retired from military service in the Qing. The Qing were much more reliant on the bow in their military tactics and strategy. They were not particularly fond of conventional crossbows. That said, the weapon was certainly rather uncommon. The Qing did do away with fletching on the arrows, and they actually experimented with other alternate projectile types on their crossbows, most specifically bullets or beads. It's a little difficult to understand what exactly this would have entailed, but the weapon is described as a Zhuge Nu or a Zhuge Nu, or aka a bullet crossbow or rapid bead crossbow. So experiments were made with lighter projectiles, probably to attempt to achieve higher velocity and greater killing power. The Qing dynasty certainly didn't rely heavily on the repeating crossbow, as I would put it. It was not considered a great military weapon. We saw that in those Qing treatises, mentioning how it was good for self-defense, for a Confucian scholar or a palace woman, but it wasn't really considered an ideal military tool, and simply had certain niche applications, and was a weapon you could readily equip peasantry with or ill-trained troops with. It was a weapon whose operation, as mentioned, was incredibly simple, and basically anybody could be taught to use it. And that most likely is what kept it in service for so long. And it continued to see service right up until the Sino-Japanese War of 1894, when supposedly some Zhuge Nus continued to see service against the Japanese, which is pretty insane. That would have been the period. At that period, bolt-action rifles were the standard. The weapon would have not been anywhere near comparable in staying power, though perhaps one could think that its rate of fire would certainly still be an advantage, and given the lighter or non-existent armor of most troops at the time, might have even been a significant advantage. But certainly compared to rifles, repeating crossbows were very, very weak and very much inefficient. But it was interesting to see just how long it lasted, even if as more of a militia weapon, much as in the same way as in Switzerland, for example, we saw halberds utilized as late as the 18th century in a militia role. And obviously at that point it was long past its expiration date, essentially, but the weapon continued to see service. And so that was really the longest serving repeating crossbow, actually. But there was one more variant of the repeating crossbow, and that's the one we're going to discuss next, and that is the Korean repeating crossbow. So we're going to move on to that and discuss that further variation. Now, before progressing to the Korean repeater crossbow, I do want to make one further note about one of the reasons that the repeater crossbow likely did not take off as much in the Chinese military, and that was most likely due to the advent of rocketry. Now, during the Three Kingdoms era and throughout much of what in Europe would have been the Dark Ages, rocketry was not really a thing through much of the medieval period in China. Rocketry only really was invented, rockets were only really invented in China sometime in the 12th century, and they were improved upon from there. It was only really with the Ming Dynasty that rockets became a viable military weapon. However, when they did become viable in this manner, rocketry was a pretty powerful force in the battlefield. It allowed a very significant amount of firepower to be delivered. Many of these variants, the Chinese had a whole bunch of different projectile variants, including ones designed to release noxious smoke, incendiary rockets, that sort of thing, and simple rockets that would fire off multiple arrows at once. And that was one of the simplest designs, and yet that very much competed with a weapon such as the Zhuge Nu. And it could deliver a similar degree of firepower, probably better firepower in a very short burst than a Zhuge Nu could, granted with certain restrictions based on weather and whatnot, and of course being much more difficult to manufacture and most likely maintain than something like a simple Zhuge Nu. However, for the better trained elements of military and for the non-peasant forces, it's likely the rockets would have been a preferable method of firepower, of generating mass firepower, than a repeater crossbow, since these were weapons that could even punch through armor. They could punch through iron armor that was pretty commonplace among Chinese troops at the time, and that's obviously a significant advantage over the Zhuge Nu, which would probably struggle to have significant impact even against lighter forms of protection. 40 pounds draw weight, once again, not the strongest weapon. Now, moving on to the Korean repeater crossbow. This was a weapon that the Koreans acquired sometime in the 15th century. They began acquiring Chinese repeater crossbows. However, they were quick to make it their own, and it was, in their usage, it was called the Suno, the hand crossbow, or the Sunogi, the hand crossbow machine, and it did follow the same basic design as a Chinese repeater crossbow. However, there were a few significant differences that set it apart and really made it a stronger weapon in many ways than its Chinese predecessor. The stock was longer. The weapon was longer, and in turn, both the lever as well as the magazine were mounted further down the butt. They are closer towards the butt of the weapon. So this allowed the user to have a greater power stroke. It allowed the bow that was utilized to be a more powerful weapon. It would oftentimes be a Korean recurve bow, simply a modified Korean bow, really, rather than these cheap, simple bamboo prods that were utilized by the Chinese. And to compensate for the fact that there was a longer distance between the string and the notch on the expanding lever, the prod on the Sunogi was actually mounted in such a way that it would pivot when the lever was cocked. And this is actually quite a significant difference. In the case of the Chinese repeater crossbow, the actual prod would simply stay fixed in place, as the magazine would kind of just shift forward slightly or shift upward slightly. It didn't have as much range of motion. So the Korean design was definitely, from what I've been able to glean, it was definitely a bit more of a consistently higher quality creation. It seemed to have been weapon much more oriented for military usage, whereas the Chinese seem to view the repeater crossbow as a weapon of last resort. And this, I think, is reflected in the way the Koreans did attempt to up the power of the bow, getting that longer power stroke, utilizing a recurve bow consistently rather than these cheap straight prods. We can also see significantly greater usage of steel or iron, most likely metal iron components in the Korean crossbows, and so that seems to have been a sort of I would say improvement over its Chinese predecessor. The Koreans also supposedly experimented with similar variants to what the Qing did. They had stone bow versions of the repeater crossbow called the Tano, as well as the Samsi Sunogi, which was a triple shot repeating crossbow, so trying to push that rapid fire up even further. However, unlike the Qing, who got rid of fletched arrows on the repeating crossbows, the Koreans stuck with fletching for the repeating crossbows they used. And they did use the repeating crossbows in warfare, supposedly using them against the Japanese, in particular during the Imjin Wars during the late 16th century. There are also supposedly records of the Koreans developing heavier repeating weaponry. Now, one of the problems is that many of the depictions of these weapons come from far later dates, and the textual evidence tends to be very sparse and oftentimes inconclusive. For example, we get descriptions of more powerful variants of repeater crossbows that only had 5 rounds in the magazine. However, we don't know if these were necessarily crew-served weapons, the artillery-style weapons, or if these were weapons designed for one man to perhaps fire a bit more slowly than a traditional repeater crossbow. It's not exactly clarified in Korean text. So that is worth keeping in mind, I believe. But certainly it was an interesting side grade or side evolution in comparison to the Chinese competition or Chinese evolution that was going on at the same time. And it also seems that the Koreans did not necessarily cling to the repeater crossbow for as long as the Chinese did. The Chinese with the Qing, most likely due to its usage as, once again, a militia weapon, seem to have stuck with the repeater crossbow much longer, whereas the Koreans seem to have done away with it much, maybe not much sooner, but seem to have not utilized it, at least not into the perhaps 19th century or 18th century, the way the Chinese did. And that was certainly a bit of a difference. So perhaps it was still being utilized in militia actions, and it just wasn't utilized in major warfare. So that is certainly something that could be kept in mind, I suppose. The Koreans were not involved in as much major warfare of their own throughout the 19th century. So that could also certainly be a reason for its seeming absence. Now, traveling back to China, we are going to examine some of the artillery crossbows that the Chinese utilized. And the Chinese really did innovate or sort of experiment a lot with their artillery crossbows, trying to generate ever-increasing amounts of firepower with these weapons. And at times this was successful, at times less so. One of the earliest examples of this innovation was the Zhuge Nu. This was a multi-shot siege crossbow that originated supposedly sometime around the end of the Warring States period. So this would have been during the sometime during the perhaps 3rd or 2nd century BC. And from there on out, the weapons slowly caught on and became ever increasingly common. Now, the basic Chinese artillery crossbows were usually essentially just a very big crossbow. Occasionally they would use multiple prods, perhaps 2, perhaps sometimes even 3 prods, just to generate additional power in a shot. And through this method, they could potentially punch through walls, punch through fortifications. They were very lethal to personnel, of course, if they should strike them or be able to score a hit. But the Chinese were also experimented with attempts to make these weapons fire faster, to make them more useful against masses of infantry. Zhuge Nu, who we discussed earlier, was actually one of the sort of main inventors or main individuals who worked on improving these siege crossbows. The Zhuge Nu crossbows could be utilized to sort of fire a large spread of multiple projectiles, sort of like a shotgun essentially, not really like a repeater. However, that was certainly an experiment made, and supposedly Zhuge Nu designed a weapon of this style called the Yuanrong, which could actually fire 10 bolts at once. Now, obviously, the accuracy on these weapons was not great. It was essentially a shotgun that you fired multiple bolts at once, hopefully striking a dense formation of troops, kind of like a canister or grape shot or buckshot, depending on what weapon you might be talking about from the firearm age. But the idea being to generate additional firepower. And this was essentially a scaled up version of the multi-bolt firing crossbows that the Chinese were already experimenting with. Supposedly, the Zhuge Nu was also sometimes interconnected, and apparently the Chinese experimented with having multiple artillery crossbows hooked up so that they could all be fired at once by one individual. Supposedly, Tao Gu wrote sometime in the 10th century AD that there was an experiment where they connected 12 of these Zhuge Nu siege crossbows to increase the firepower that could be attained. Now, just how useful this was in a practical sense is debatable. Obviously, you can get more shots that way at once, but after that, somebody's got to reload, and realistically, that means you need a crew to be reloading. However, there were further experiments later on during the Ming Dynasty. This was all pre-Ming Dynasty. Under the Ming Dynasty, there were some significant further improvements made to Chinese crossbow technology, artillery crossbows. For one was the Shen Bi Chuang Zi Lian Cheng Nu, which translates roughly as the defined limb bed-linked fortress crossbow. This was a defensive crossbow that was actually fitted onto a wooden frame. It was a multi-shot crossbow that fired 4 poisoned arrows at once. The Chinese actually utilized poison on projectiles for heavier crossbows as well. This was actually not something limited or purely recommended for the Zhuge Nu, and I do believe that is worth mentioning. Supposedly, the arrow's poison was stored inside a box that was kept under the wooden frame, and the weapon was operated by 3 men. It was a crew-served weapon. Each of these men had a chong gun, which was often called a border gun or a frontier gun, and this was essentially a mix of a quarterstaff and a firearm. Like a very large firearm, and the idea was that besides giving the crew some sort of self-defense weapon, the crew could also utilize these large quarterstaff-shaped guns to move the large artillery crossbow around. The Cheng Nu could be loaded up onto 2 of the frontier guns and then repositioned to a new position, sort of like you would move a stretcher around. This could be done with 2 or 4 men, depending on how many you had available. So that was one of the many Chinese artillery crossbow experiments. One of those designed to get multiple shots at once. Keep in mind, this weapon is still essentially just an oversized crossbow. It's not, the Chinese didn't necessarily make use of sort of the twisted skins or the torsion systems that were utilized on weapons such as the ballista or onager in the West. Most of these weapons were essentially just scaled up crossbows, and to generate additional power, the Chinese would usually simply use more prods, and this could actually work rather effectively. It's using 2-3 prods. Supposedly, some of these crossbows were capable of punching through walls. Now, the Chinese also developed a Zhuge Nu. This was a nest crossbow, a weapon that was specifically designed to use in a tripwire trap. And it was a simple crossbow that was set up to be triggered by tripwire. Sometimes they would connect multiples of these crossbows, and one variant of this crossbow was known as the Zhuge Nu, and this was actually a double shot version of the Zhuge Nu. So the Chinese used these crossbows in this sort of autonomous defensive role, which is a pretty clever and interesting sort of approach. And finally, we do have the Shuang Fei Nu, and this was the twin flying crossbow, and it was a defensive crossbow system that linked multiple double shot crossbows together. These were, as far as I'm aware, normal crossbows. These were not any sort of heavier artillery crossbow, but it was designed to be triggered by utilizing a mechanism that was stepped upon to fire the weapon. Now, the quantity in which these exotic artillery pieces were actually utilized is highly debatable. As gunpowder became more and more prevalent under the Ming, and later, of course, under the Qing, many of these artillery pieces completely fell out of favor and simply were retired. As we know, by the time of the Qing Empire, the crossbow, or the conventional crossbow, was essentially retired, and with it went most of the artillery. The Chinese did move on to black powder weapons. So that is certainly something I think worth keeping in mind when discussing these large experimental artillery crossbows. However, it is definitely, I think, interesting to see just how they functioned and just how many experiments were made in gaining and acquiring or designing these multi-shot crossbows for the Chinese. Now, certainly in this whole list, by far the most used of the weapons was definitely the Zhuge Nu, especially during the Ming period, and later during the Qing period it saw some continued usage. These artillery pieces were more sort of exotic or rare sights on the battlefield. However, once again, I think they are worth mentioning and once more worth discussing. And it actually compares in some ways. These multi-shot crossbows do certainly compare to some of the weapons we do see in Warhammer, of course, such as the multi-shot, of course, that is present on for both the Dark Elf and High Elf bolt throwers. And it makes sense. These weapons are in many ways akin to the Chinese, the large Chinese crossbows. And so I think in that sense it is a pretty sensible comparison. But for our last item of note, we are going to be moving west to the lands of the Mediterranean to examine the Polybolos. Now, the Polybolos was a Greek repeating ballista or catapult that was designed during the 3rd century BC. It was designed by the Greek engineer and inventor Dionysius of Alexandria for the arsenal at Rhodes. And the Rhodians seem to be interested in this weapon. Why exactly is not certain, though obviously nations are usually interested or curious in fancier ways of killing others. And the Rhodians would have certainly been no exception, perhaps due to their low manpower as well. This would have been added incentive to try to innovate a method of getting more firepower without more manpower. But whatever the case may be, the weapon was designed for them, and it was then inspected and described by Philo of Byzantium, who was also an engineer and writer who sort of arrived to examine the weapon at the time. Now, from his descriptions is really where we've gotten most of our information about the Polybolos. The rest of what we know or think we know nowadays mostly comes from reenactors or experimental archaeologists and enthusiasts who have set about recreating the weapon based on Philo's original descriptions. Now, despite the painstaking detail many of these individuals have gone to recreate the weapon, obviously with modern day technology, modern day techniques, and it's likely that at least some of the recreations are at least somewhat or at least probably not exactly precisely the same as Dionysius' original. However, it does give us a very clear idea of just what the weapon would have been capable of or was capable of at the time of its innovation. Now, from Philo's description, we do know the weapon utilized some form of early chain drive, and this would have been very novel at the time. Supposedly, there were 2 flat-link chains on either side, or a flat-link chain on either side of the Polybolos. These ran over pentagonal prisms that were on either end of the chain's loop, and it was speculated these worked as a sort of inverted gear. You'd have the soldier turn the windlass that was attached to the rear of the weapon, and the bolts would be locked, they'd be loaded, and they would fire automatically. The bolts were fed in from a vertical magazine that was attached to the top of the weapon, and the result was that the weapon achieved a significantly higher rate of fire than other ancient artillery pieces. It had it's based on modern day reenactments. It's been gleaned that it probably had about 3 to 6 times the rate of fire of other catapults or ballistas of the time. Now, this is still only an estimate, once again, coming from the position that it's probably not a precise copy, but still, it does give us a very nice estimate of how much more efficient this weapon may have been. However, the weapon never really caught on. Now, why exactly it didn't catch on is a bit of a debate. For one, perhaps complexity. It did require this newfangled chain drive. This had to be manufactured with some precision. Artillery pieces were already a bit of an artisan's weapon during the ancient period, and especially during the medieval. But during the ancient period, they were certainly much of an artisan's weapon, and so trying to manufacture this sort of tool on a grand scale would most likely be difficult and very expensive, perhaps prohibitively. So keep in mind when machine guns came about, they were prohibitively expensive for the majority of nations as well. And obviously, while this was no machine gun, the technology involved was relatively advanced for the time. The whole notion of the chain drive used to load it was something new. Now, the other complaint, and of course this would result in its own logistical issues. Most likely the weapon would need unique parts to be shipped along with it in case there were breakdowns or something went awry, whereas normally if you had a bowstring snap or you would simply have more rope to replace it with, and perhaps repairs could be done much more easily in the field. As long as you had some skillful engineers, you might need more logistical support, and this would have been unacceptable, I think, for a lot of ancient armies. Another supposed complaint was actually that the weapon was too precise. And this seems like a really odd complaint to have made, but supposedly this is something Philo wrote in his in his description of the weapon, that it was actually too accurate. That supposedly the lack of dispersion in the shot pattern meant that the weapon was overkill for humans, and that it was too precise. Not entirely sure what that's supposed to imply. Supposedly the weapon, though, for reconstructions was in fact very precise. Erwin Schramm, a German engineer in the 19th century, actually recreated the weapon, and supposedly the weapon was so accurate that the second bolt it fired split the first bolt that struck the target. So the weapon seemed to have been very accurate. However, why this would necessarily be a weakness, I'm not entirely sure. Perhaps the weapon's mounting. This is not something I've necessarily been able to find too much information on. Perhaps the weapon's mounting was fixed, and as a result, moving the weapon around was very clumsy and unwieldy. So in that case, I could understand why the weapons, since it was not mounted in the nature of, say, a machine gun on a tripod. So in that situation, I could understand why perhaps the excessive precision would be undesirable, because your opponent would see where your shot hits, and then they'd know that your next shot is going to land there exactly, and you've got no way of adjusting quickly. However, whether this was something that could have been fixed separately, I'm not entirely sure if that was to be attributed to the machine's design or simply the high-end or high-quality manufacturing process for the time that was used for the machine. I'm not entirely sure why, but it was a complaint made by Philo, and the weapon certainly didn't catch on. If I was to make a guess, I would say the logistical issues and the cost issues were probably the bigger problem, and know-how issues were the bigger problem than the precision. But I could certainly be wrong, and it was a comment made by Philo, and certainly worth keeping in mind. And that is it for repeating weapons prior to firearms. Now, moving on to the world of Warhammer, we do not have too many repeating weapons in the category of pre-firearm. Really, the only major weapons in that category right now are, of course, the Dark Elf repeater crossbows, and then the bolt throwers, which fire a scattershot projectile. Now, covering the scattershot first, because that is really simple and easy. I think it's perfectly sensible. The way it's depicted seems to make sense, given that it's probably a pretty powerful bow. I could see how it's armor piercing pretty easily. It makes perfect sense that such a projectile would just tear through people very efficiently. Perhaps the anti-infantry of the nature of it might not make that much sense. You'd think such a scatter of projectiles would probably do grievous harm even to a big monster, but obviously that's balance reasons. But certainly it makes sense that the weapon is a sort of anti-personnel shotgun blast, and I think that is a pretty accurate sort of description in comparison to the Chinese artillery pieces that were utilized throughout the Ming period, whether those be the multi-prod crossbows or otherwise the sort of multi-shot defensive crossbows, such as the fortress crossbows with that fired 4 projectiles at once, or whatever else it may have been. I think the comparison is rather accurate there. Now, so on the topic of Dark Elf repeater crossbows, however, I think to say they are inaccurate would be a bit of an understatement. The design is quite frankly ridiculous. Now, obviously, there are issues of balance and issues of tabletop from which the game is derived, and the tabletop models from which the designs are derived, so that is all its own thing. However, the Warhammer design of the repeater crossbows is just kind of nonsensical. Now, I'm not going to go simply off of Total War's design here. Vermintide, of course, does have repeater crossbows as well, for Carillion as well as Saltspire, and the Empire repeater crossbow, while looking a bit goofy, is, I think, more sensible in the case of Vermintide. But the Dark Elf repeater seems really, really nonsensical. It has no discernible spanning device, which is an immediate sort of weird point. Why is there no spanning device? How are you supposed to reload this thing? And it is supposed to fire like a repeater crossbow. Now, granted, in Total War, the weapon fires 2 shots at once, so it could be functioning like a double shot, perhaps like a Lian Fan Nu, a double shot repeater crossbow of that nature, where you've got a longer reload in between each 2 shots. That doesn't really sound right, though. It still doesn't explain the fact that there is no reloading mechanism, or no discernible reloading mechanisms for the weapon. Besides, I guess it is supposed to be a repeater crossbow after all, and there's no discernible method of it repeating. So that is one thing. So how it works, first and foremost, is just a bit confusing. Unless there is some sort of spring-wound reload mechanism, which does not seem to be the case. I'm really not sure how the weapon is supposed to function. However, that aside, then of course are the weapon's characteristics. The short range, fair enough, that should be a factor, and the double shot actually isn't too nonsensical. It makes sense. Several of the Chinese repeater crossbow variants we've seen fired 2 or more projectiles at once, so that I think is not too much of a stretch. However, the armor-piercing nature of the weapon and the relative precision of the weapon just seems pretty darn ridiculous. The repeater crossbow was a very inaccurate weapon, extremely inaccurate. Now, granted, in tabletop, its range and accuracy is actually even better than it is, I think, in Total War, which is pretty nuts. Sitting at, I believe it's 24 inches range, which was almost on par with normal crossbows and bows. So that was definitely pretty nuts. But the weapon should definitely not have a lot of range. The effective range should be really pitiful. And given that the effective range was considered about 70 meters, that's not a lot. At that point, you're barely outside the range of throwing weapons. Should probably be more akin to something like the Goblin short bows than any sort of a bow or firearm or anything of that nature. And the actual AP characteristics of the weapon just make no sense whatsoever. The power on this weapon would be terrible. If it had some spring-bound mechanism to reload it or something along those lines, it would probably be even weaker than hand-loaded, I would suspect. And especially because the mechanism has to be contained within that tiny box on the actual weapon. And obviously, historical repeater crossbows had pretty terrible staying power. Now, one could argue it's an elf reloading it, but elves aren't really supposed to be much, if any, stronger than a human. It's more skillful, perhaps, but that's not the same thing as being just straight-up buffer. And the fact that the repeater crossbow pierces armor, where a dwarf crossbow, especially, for example, just does not, seems very, very awry. And I do get that in tabletop, the weapon also had the armor-piercing trait, which is just ridiculous. Repeating crossbows would just not be armor-piercing. And it's actually depicted, from what I understand, pretty accurately in Total War 3 Kingdoms, where the weapon has very poor armor-penetrating characteristics and functions as a suppression weapon, which is really how it would be utilized in historical warfare. But in Warhammer, the weapon is just horrifically depicted in comparison to history. Really has basically nothing to do with the historical iteration, outside of some vague aesthetic similarities. And that is really all there is to say for it. So, from the Warhammer perspective, the multi-shot bolt throwers I think are pretty cool. Obviously, the designs are Warhammery and ridiculous, but the actual mechanism of firing multiple arrows at once and it being a sort of shotgun scatter shot makes sense. The maximum range might be a bit much. In practice, you probably wouldn't get that much range out of it, but still, I think that is forgivable and makes sense. The repeater crossbow I think is completely nuts and really just makes no sense. Now, obviously, next video I will be focusing on repeater firearms, so that will be the follow-up to this wonderful topic here. If you guys have your own input and your own insight that you'd like to share, as usual, don't hesitate to post that down below. I would love to hear what you guys have to say. I'd love to hear what you guys, if you guys have anything else to share or anything you'd like to mention or anything you feel like I left out and should have mentioned, certainly feel free to share it, and I'd love to hear about it. especially in regards to combat history, because from what I was able to glean, the Zhuge Nu was really not a popular combat weapon. Most of the written records I read of it in regards to it were busy criticizing it for how terrible it was as a combat weapon. And while it certainly did see some combat usage, it was nothing, from what I understand, impressive. But certainly, as usual, guys, don't hesitate to post down below. And I will do my best to respond as soon as I can. I do thank you all for watching, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye for now.